Professor Emilie van Haute, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
My pleasure.
Let me start right away with the first question. What are the key similarities and differences between left-wing and right-wing populist parties in Belgium in terms of their ideology, voter base, and political strategies? How have economic, social, and cultural factors contributed to the rise of populist movements in Belgium? How do these factors differ between the radical left, PTB, and the radical right, Vlaams Blanc?
Well, that's three broad questions. I think so. The commonalities between the two radical forces is their protest appeal. So the protest and populist appeal, and you can clearly see also in the voters that they attract that that this protest appeal is quite strong. So that's the commonality, because otherwise, in terms of political positioning, they are at the two opposite extremes. So clearly, politically, they are radically different. So the radical right is a position to the extreme right, both socioeconomically and culturally, because we often hear that the radical right can sometimes have a blurred position on socioeconomic issue. It's not the case. They are located at the right end of the political spectrum, whereas the radical left is on the left, both socioeconomically and socioculturally. So these two political forces are not identical when it comes to their political positions, but what they share and what they have in common is a protest appeal, protest towards mainstream parties and towards the political system. So that's how I would say they are similar or different. Now, what drives their success is basically, again, discontent and a lack of trust in mainstream political actors. That generates discontent and protest, and so they have a strong protest appeal, and that's where they find their success. Now, why is it the radical right that attracts support in Belgium, in the north of the country, so in Flanders, and radical left in the south, in French-speaking Belgium? It is because we have two different party systems in Belgium. On the Dutch-speaking side, it is a party system that is dominated by mainstream right. And the mainstream right, when you protest against the mainstream right, then voters turn to the clean or pure equivalent, which is the radical right. They are not happy with the mainstream right, they shift to the radical right. Whereas in French-speaking Belgium, the dominant actor was the Socialist Party, which is mainstream left. And so when you're not happy with the mainstream left, as a voter, you go to the alternate, which is the radical left. And that's why you've seen these polarizing trends occurring in Belgium.
Right. How has Belgium's political landscape changed over the last decade, especially in relation to the growing influence of Vlaams Blanc and the Workers' Party of Belgium, PTB? Looking at the historical trajectory, how have populism and populist parties developed over time? Would you classify sub-state nationalist parties such as N-VA, VB, and DEFI as populist movements?
Okay, so the evolutions over the last decade is clearly an evolution towards more polarization of the political landscape because of this success of radical parties. The radical parties have pulled the party systems to the extremes. And so you clearly see that voters increasingly position themselves a bit more away from the center. So that is one of the most important evolutions. the radical right has fluctuated over time. So if you look at the electoral performances of Vlaams Belang, it has evolved. It's a party that had a constant increase in its electoral performances over the 1990s until the early 2000s. Then it reached the ceiling. N-VA came, mainstream right, as an alternate option for voters. And so at that time, Vlaams Belang started to lose voters to the benefit of N-VA. Because N-VA had that protest appeal, it had not participated to the federal government. As soon as N-VA entered the federal government, it lost its protest appeal, and then you saw the shift again. Vlaams Belang started to gain voters again, and N-VA started losing voters. So there's been that back and forth in the Dutch-speaking political landscape, party landscape, between mainstream right and radical right. And right now we are at a point where the radical right again has regained the protest or embodies the protest appeal, and so is again on the rise. On the French-speaking side, there's never been a successful radical right party. Again, as I mentioned, because the radical left has embodied the protest appeal. And the radical left only gained traction since the last 2-3 federal elections. So it's a more recent phenomenon. So that's for the evolution. Now, who to characterize as radical or populist? So clearly, Vlaams Belang and PTB, PVDA qualify as radical parties. Whether other parties have a populist component, which is a kind of a protest appeal component, that fluctuates over time. And clearly N-VA at some point had that protest appeal, and so had also a populist component. You can see that when the party enters or entered the federal coalition, first in 2014 and again now, the protest component drops. It's really hard to be included and in power while at the same time keeping a protest discourse. You're part of the establishment and you're the decision maker, so it's hard to keep the component of criticizing the decision makers when you're part of it. And so N-VA has starting to lose that protest populist component. And you've asked also about how to qualify DEFI, another regionalist party. DEFI is mainly a Brussels party, so a party that defends French speakers in Brussels. And there they've been part of coalition governments at the regional level for a long time. And so there they do not necessarily have a protest component, but they tried to develop a branch in Wallonia, which is the other French-speaking part of the country, in the south of the country. And there they had a strong protest component because they were an emerging party, they were against the existing actors, and so they had a strong protest component. So you really see that parties have that protest and populist component, especially when they are sitting in the opposition and in a position to oppose mainstream parties in their respective party systems.
Right. What are the drivers of support for populist radical left and populist radical right parties in Belgium. How have protest attitudes and ideological considerations affected the recent results of Vlaams and Parti du Travail de Belgique?
But clearly, these two parties, they share as main driver, again, the protest component. So voters who have a low level of political trust, so trust in political institutions, have a higher probability to vote for these parties. Voters who are cynical towards the political system, voters who have a low level of political interest, and voters who do not necessarily feel politically efficacious, so who do not feel that they can change the political system. All these attitudes are drivers of a vote for these two radical parties. So in a nutshell, it's voters who are and feel alienated towards the political system, and mainstream parties, they opt to vote for these radical parties. But they do not choose randomly. They choose also protest parties that fit their political priorities. So it's parties that have a protest component, but also parties who offer specific political positions. In Flanders, voters who vote for the Vlaams Belang, they are located on the right of the political spectrum, and especially they put migration issues at the top of their priorities. So it's protest voters who vote for a party that matches their political priorities, but that is more radical than the mainstream parties in power. So it's really a protest against the mainstream parties in power. So they want certain policies. They are disappointed by the governing parties, and they vote for the alternate parties, more radical parties, on the same kind of issues.
Right.
In French-speaking Belgium, it's the same. It's protest voters, but they would vote for radical left parties for their positions on socioeconomic issues and their left-wing positions on socioeconomic issues.
All right. Considering that radical right parties like Vlaams Belang thrive in Flanders, whereas French-speaking populist radical right parties struggle to gain traction, how does linguistic fragmentation impact the ideological positioning and success of populist radical parties in Belgium?
So in Flanders, Vlaams Belang is clearly also a ethno-regionalist party, so a party that defends Flemish culture and interests, and so that is also in favor of more autonomy for Flanders. It's not the case in French-speaking Belgium. The radical party that has the most traction is PTB-PVDA. It is a unitary party, so a party that has branches over the entire national territory, and that's an exception in Belgium. And so because of that, because of this specific feature of having branches both in Flanders and French-speaking Belgium, makes it difficult for this party to advocate for regionalism. So it's a party that says and emphasizes socioeconomic issues as being prominent, and solidarity throughout the national territory as being necessary on socioeconomic issues. So it's quite different here. You see in French-speaking Belgium, the Radical Party advocating for more national solidarity when it comes to socioeconomic redistribution. And in Flanders, it's a Vlaams Belang advocating for more autonomy for Flanders. And that's also one of the polarizing debates in Belgium.
Right. A new government has just been announced in Belgium under the leadership of New Flemish Alliance, N-VA, with Bart de Wever becoming the country's first nationalist prime minister. How would you define the N-VA as a political party? Based on your research, how do you explain the party's emergence and breakthrough, its organizational choices, ideological profile, prospects for survival, and the potential trajectory following its first experience in government?
Sorry, I missed the start of your question.
I just said a new government has just been announced in Belgium. How would you define N-VA as a political party? And then based on your research, how do you explain the party's emergence and breakthrough, its organizational choices, ideological profile, and prospects for survival following its first experience in government?
So N-VA is actually the heir of a former ethno-regionalist party, Volksuni. So it's not necessarily a new party. It exists as it is since 2001, but was the heir of the Volksuni, which is a party that emerged in 1954. So it's kind of a new party with old roots. Which is important to understand because it's a new party that could establish its organization on old Volksuni local party branches. So it's a party that quite quickly developed territorial anchorage. And that's extremely important for parties' survival. So that's one of the explanations why it is a party that could establish itself and survive quite easier than other new parties. It's a party that locates itself on the right wing of the political spectrum, both socioeconomically and culturally. Initially, the party performed poorly electorally and had to establish an alliance with the Christian Democrats in Flanders. And that's really what kind of saved them and also put them in a position to look like a protest party, because it's a party that allied with the Christian Democrats, but said we are a more radical version than the Christian Democrats. We will not compromise on a certain number of issues, especially the linguistic issues. And that's something that appealed to voters, especially, as I mentioned already, from the Vlaams Belang. So some voters from the Vlaams Belang said, okay, this new party or new old party appears as pure also on linguistic issues, but is more embedded and has a chance to participate to power, because Vlaams Belang is excluded from power due to a cordon sanitaire. So some of the voters, former voters from the Vlaams Belang decided, okay, we're going to give it a chance to N-VA because they have a chance to participate in government, and they are also quite radical on a number of positions that we share. And so that's what where the N-VA built its position. It's a party that has already, from the start, participated to power at the regional level. So it's a party that has regional coalition government experience in Flanders. And it has already participated once to the federal government in 2014, between 2014 and 2019. So it's not an unexperienced party. So it has experience, it has an organization, a very strong party organization. And I think those elements are important aspects for its chances of survival. So yeah, it's a party that is there and is there for the long term.
Okay. As you mentioned in your articles, the Flemish Nationalist Party, N-VA, is a relatively young or newly established party. How do you account for its success, and what internal and external dynamics have contributed to its rise, given the N-VA's evolution from a regionalist successor party to a dominant force in Belgian politics? What insights can be drawn about the adaptability and trajectory of nationalist and populist radical right movements?
So N-VA is, as we mentioned, an old new party, so established in 2001 with roots from a former ethno-regionalist party. The way it developed is that it became not a single issue party. So regionalist issues were central, but they were not enough to gain electoral traction. So they embedded their ethno-regionalism into socioeconomic issues. So they started developing a socioeconomic program that is conservative, but it's conservative ethno-regionalism, saying we want to reward workers. We want to reward the workforce and economic dynamism. But behind that, it's rewarding Flanders, because Flanders has a higher active workforce than French-speaking Belgium, where you have more people on unemployment benefits. And so rewarding the workforce is rewarding Flanders. And that's how they combined the two topics, saying we are economically conservative because that's also a way to reward and defend the interests of Flanders, and stopping what they call solidarity transfers to lazy, unemployed French speakers in the rest of the country. So that's how they combined the two core issues and managed to appeal to a broader electoral audience.
Right. Belgium has traditionally been regarded as a classic example of consociational or consensus democracy. How does this political system influence the opportunities and constraints faced by populist parties? And in what ways have these parties adjusted to Belgium's intricate institutional structure? In the light of N-VA's electoral success and the growing support for Vlaams Belang, do you believe this characterization still accurately reflects Belgium's political landscape?
No. Consensual democracies and Belgium has been an ideal type of consensus or consensual democracy. But you can clearly see that first in Flanders, you can see the growing antagonisms, and it's clearly partly driven by N-VA. And I would say N-VA more even than Vlaams Belang, because N-VA plays a very antagonistic game and does not necessarily play by the consensus logic, which has, of course, an effect on voters. And you can see progressively more polarization among voters in Flanders than in French-speaking Belgium. Although you start to see the same in French-speaking Belgium, partly due to the radical left, but also increasingly the conservatives, so the French-speaking liberals also playing kind of the same role as the role that N-VA had played in Flanders. You can see that the conservative party in French-speaking Belgium is starting to play the same. So the consensus habits, I would say, are slightly and slowly vanishing. And I think that's a huge challenge for future government formation, but also for the maintenance of coalition governments. It's hard to stay in power for 4 to 5 years with currently 5 partners if you are constantly playing an antagonistic game. So I think that's going to be challenging, increasingly challenging. And we've seen that government formation and coalition stability have been increasingly difficult because of this slowly vanishing consensus democracy.
All right. How has effective polarization been instrumental in Belgian elections and in the success of populist parties? How do you think separatist politics will be influenced by the victory of N-VH?
So we've seen effective polarization being present in Belgium, again, more so in Flanders than in French-speaking Belgium. This is because of the presence of Vlaams Belang and also N-VH in Flanders, polarizing the electorate into groups that do not necessarily like each other. But we start to see the same happening also in French-speaking Belgium. So affective polarization is present, not as much as in other representative democracies around. So it's still at a lower level compared to other representative democracies. But we see, and that's a sign of that vanishing consensus, right? So there's a growing dislike between electorates from different parties. And I think that's both, it's a self-feeding cycle, right? Parties antagonize, voters are more polarized. If voters are more polarized, parties are less incentivized to consensus. And so that's a self-feeding circle.
Right. Given the indirect contamination effect of populist parties on mainstream political discourse, how has their presence impacted traditional parties in Belgium? Have mainstream parties adopted elements of populist rhetoric or policies in response?
Clearly, it's a yes again. And you see it, the way mainstream parties react to their radical competition is by imitation. Okay, so in Flanders, typically, the mainstream right, it is N-VH, and to a lesser extent, the Christian Democrats, so CD&V, and the liberals, Open VLD. Clearly, N-VH has adopted some of the rhetoric of the radical right. They have made migration issue very salient. When they were in power at the federal level between 2014 and 2019, actually they exited the government before the end of the legislature on migration issues. And that has, and research shows that mimicking the radical right tends to legitimize their positions and also facilitate their electoral success. So in Flanders, you see clear mimicking of the radical right. So a mainstreaming of the radical right's positions. In French-speaking Belgium, the Socialist Party, which was the mainstream left dominant party, challenged by the radical left, they also adopted a more radical position on socioeconomic issues. So you can really see there that the presence of these radical parties tends to polarize the political spectrum. And in French-speaking Belgium, what you saw is then a rightization of the Liberal Party, so the Conservative Party. So when they were facing a very strongly to the left Socialist Party and Workers' Party, the Conservative Party went more to the right to play that antagonistic game. And so you saw a polarization very clearly.
How do Belgian populist parties engage with European politics, particularly in relation to the European Union? and broader transnational populist networks?
Clearly, towards the European Union, it's an easy anti-EU rhetoric, doing Europe bashing for a number of the problems that they that they want to make salient. So and that's a commonality between the radical right and the radical left. The Eurosceptic views and positions. That being said, there are links with transnational movements of the same kind. So you can see links between Vlaams Belang and other populist radical right parties in Europe, even if it's a bit of a love-hate relationship, and it's not that easy to coordinate when you advocate also the interest of your national states. To advocate for international collaboration is a bit in tension. On the left, the radical left party has strong ties to other radical left parties in Europe, and there the collaboration is old and so rather and easier to sell in a way. But so it's Eurosceptic with some form of transnational collaboration.
All right. And lastly, Professor Van Haute, how do you think populist parties in Belgium will be affected by the second Trump administration in the US?
I fear less about populist radical parties than how mainstream parties are going to be affected. That's my main fear. You see the conservative parties, both NVA and MR, so on the French and the Dutch-speaking side, the main conservative parties adopting some of the strategies, rhetoric of the early Trump, so maybe Trump 2016. We'll see if they are going to move to adopting Trump 2.0 version, but that's the main fear. It's not necessarily the radical parties that are sitting in the opposition, and it's more governing parties, again, adopting these radical rhetorics. That is the main challenge.
Okay, Professor Emilie van Haute, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.